The silence was deceptive. From my office, a cluttered glass cubicle overlooking the nerve center of the Argus Panoptes Observatory Mission Control, space seemed as quiet as ever, as indifferent to our prying as it had been for millennia. Yet, the data pouring into the servers from 1.5 million kilometers away told a different story. The cosmos wasn't silent, it was screaming. We just hadn't learned to listen properly. I leaned back in my chair, rolling the edge of a graphite stylus between my fingers. The room around me hummed, not with some ethereal menace, but the ordinary noise of cooling fans, distant conversations, and the clatter of keyboards. Rows of analysts worked under a low light that gave the room the aura of a dimmed amphitheater. Outside the reinforced windows, the desert stretched away, a pale and cracked reminder of Earth's fragility. My desk was a battlefield. Star charts curled under the weight of empty coffee mugs, printouts scattered like abandoned flags, and 2 monitors blinked with a steady cascade of spectral data from the Argus. The telescope was a marvel, a triumph of international collaboration. 18 meters of precision-engineered beryllium mirror segmented into 36 pieces, each programmed to adapt to the slightest imperfection. It was humanity's most ambitious attempt to peer into the edges of existence, and now it had found something. It started as a blip, a faint irregularity deep in the Oort cloud, just beyond the reach of familiar solar system dynamics. The kind of anomaly that analysts flagged for review before moving on to something more substantial. I'd caught it during my routine survey of incoming data, the faintest deviation in light intensity from the distant outskirts of the Oort cloud, where no significant activity was expected. At first, I dismissed it as noise, a stray pixel in the universe's endless noise. But I'd run the numbers anyway. I always ran the numbers. Obsession had a way of filling the gaps where things like family or friends might have once been. The anomaly didn't fit. No distant comet, no rogue planet, and certainly no known astrophysical model accounted for an object of its apparent scale, drifting within the Oort cloud, where nothing of such precision should exist. The tension in my chest grew sharper each time. The thing was unlike anything I'd seen. It wasn't just a smear of light or an irregular shadow. There was structure, symmetry even, but irregular in a way that made it unclassifiable. Its surface was smooth in some places, rough in others. At its center, a dark region absorbed nearly all surrounding light. No, not absorbed, redirected. My pulse quickened. I could already hear the jeers from the old guard. Artifacts, they'd say. Equipment error. Argus was too advanced for that, but skepticism had a way of clinging like old paint, no matter how many layers you applied. "Royce, you've been staring at the same quadrant for hours," called Jacob Healy from the console bank behind me. His voice carried the casual indifference of a man who thought he'd seen it all. "Let me guess, Rogue Moon." Jacob was part of the team assigned to Argus's exoplanet survey mission, a seasoned astrophysicist with a penchant for sarcasm. His chair squeaked as he turned to face me. I didn't bother replying. I knew what he'd say if I tried explaining it. Instead, I pulled my monitor closer and zoomed in further. "Don't break the glass," he added, chuckling. "It's just space, man, nothing new under the stars." I should have let the comment roll off me, but I didn't. Jacob's smugness wasn't the problem. It was the realization that I couldn't quite articulate what I was looking at. For all my precision and calculations, for all the algorithms and theories crammed into my head, words failed me. It was just there. The anomaly became sharper the longer I stared, its edges resolving in my mind even as the data refused to clarify it. Something shifted in my gut. Fear, maybe. Awe. The kind of feeling you get when the familiar turns unfamiliar. Like seeing a face you recognize in a crowd only to realize it's not human. I logged the coordinates, double-checked them, and marked the anomaly for a deeper imaging pass. The AI-driven adaptive optics would refine the view over the next several hours. By morning, I'd have a clearer picture, assuming I could sleep at all. The hours ticked by, the noise of mission control fading as most of the staff clocked out for the night. I stayed behind, pacing between my workstation and the observation bay. The desert sky stretched beyond the glass, clear and sharp. Above it, Argus sat at the Sun-Earth Lagrange Point 2, steady and silent in its orbit. It wasn't watching me, of course, but it felt like it was. By the time the updated images arrived, the control room was empty. I opened the first file and the breath caught in my throat. The anomaly wasn't just a random blot or irregular shape. It had form, structure, surface patterns that could have been veins or fractures or some combination of both. My pulse hammered in my ears as I dragged the image to full resolution. There, in the center of its vast shape, was what could only be described as a pupil. My stylus slipped from my hand and clattered against the desk. I stared at the screen, waiting for my rational mind to offer some explanation. A celestial illusion, a play of shadows from the star's light. But the more I stared, the less convincing those explanations became. There was symmetry to it. Intention, almost. I reached for my comms headset. "Jacob," I said into the silence. My voice came out rough, unsteady. "You need to see this." "What?" he replied after a long pause. His voice was groggy, annoyed. "It's midnight, Royce. Can't it wait?" "No," I said. "It can't." Minutes later he arrived, bleary-eyed and muttering about my penchant for dramatics. That changed when he saw the screen. The color drained from his face. "That's not—" he began, then stopped. His eyes darted over the image, scanning for anything that might contradict what was in front of him. "It's real," I said quietly. "I triple-checked the data." Jacob's hand hovered over the keyboard. "What the hell is it?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how to. But as we stared at the image together, a single thought rose in my mind, unbidden and terrible. It's looking at us. The anomaly was not a trick of the telescope. By the following morning, Argus had rendered its image in breathtaking clarity, and any lingering hope that this was some astrophysical illusion evaporated like dew in sunlight. On the main monitor, the anomaly loomed, a sphere too vast to fathom, too precise to be natural. Its surface glistened with an almost organic sheen, rippling as though alive. It hovered in the vast expanse of the Oort cloud, far beyond where anything so deliberate should exist. I found myself leaning forward as if proximity to the screen might help me comprehend it. It didn't. The most disquieting feature was its pupil, an obsidian disc, perfectly circular, a void darker than any black hole I'd studied. Surrounding it, the iris shimmered in layered hues of amber, gold, and blood red, each band marked with lines that could have been veins, rivers, or circuits. They were too precise for chance, yet too chaotic for any conventional design. My breath caught as I realized one edge of the pupil had shifted. A subtle adjustment. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Jacob was perched on the edge of my desk, arms crossed, his usual smirk absent. A day earlier, he would have laughed at me for obsessing over a glitch. Now he said nothing, his eyes locked on the screen. Behind us, the room buzzed with subdued murmurs as the rest of the night shift gathered to gape at the feed. "I've seen light echoes before," Jacob muttered almost to himself. "Nova remnants, stellar mirages. This isn't... It's something else." "You're stating the obvious," I said. The screen updated again, revealing finer detail on the object's surface. The veins, or fractures, or whatever they were, appeared to glow with reflected starlight, a pattern so regular it felt deliberate. The ripple across the sphere's surface seemed to contract, then expand, as though the entire structure were breathing. "God," Jacob said under his breath, "it's moving." He was right. Over the next several hours, using Argus's advanced tracking systems, I mapped the object's trajectory. It wasn't orbiting the red giant randomly. It followed a pattern, an elliptical path with slight but measurable shifts in inclination. Each shift brought its vast pupil closer to alignment with Earth. "This can't be coincidental," I said to no one in particular. My finger traced the lines of the trajectory on the touchscreen. "It's deliberate." Jacob ran a hand through his thinning hair. "You're saying it's looking at us?" "I'm saying it's aiming at us. Look at the data." The room had grown silent. Every analyst, every technician was staring at the screen or their own terminals, cross-checking the data in quiet urgency. I could feel the tension radiating from them, equal parts disbelief and dread. These were people who had spent their lives peering into the vast, indifferent void of space. To see something looking back was an unspoken nightmare. As the hours stretched into a day, the anomaly continued its slow reorientation. Its pupil now faced a point just shy of Earth's position. I tried to convince myself that it was still coincidence, that any apparent intent was an artifact of my own paranoia. But then the AI flagged a new dataset. A measurable emission radiated from the object, gravitational waves. "Gravitational distortions from the Oort cloud's mass?" one of the junior analysts suggested, his voice breaking the fragile quiet. But he already knew the answer. "No." I tapped through the analysis, overlaying the wave data with the trajectory map. The emissions weren't random. They were modulated, structured. Each wave came in a burst, followed by a precise interval, then another burst, a pattern, a signal. "Christ," Jacob muttered. "It's talking." It was an absurd conclusion, yet it fit. The gravitational waves weren't natural phenomena. They were directed. As the emissions intensified, the frequency of the waves aligned with Earth's position on its orbital path, like a tuning fork seeking resonance. I ran the data through every model I could think of, searching for an explanation that wouldn't lead me to the terrifying, inevitable truth. "Royce," Jacob said, his voice low, urgent. "You need to escalate this." I hesitated. My career had already been marred by accusations of recklessness and sensationalism. If I brought this to the project leads, I'd need irrefutable evidence. Another misstep, and I'd be finished for good. But this wasn't just about me. My ego, my reputation, none of that mattered anymore. An hour later, I stood in the mission director's office, presenting the data to a panel of supervisors. The room was cavernous, its walls lined with displays of Argus's achievements, exoplanet discoveries, infrared mappings of galactic cores, pristine images of distant nebulae. I'd once aspired to have my name carved into that legacy. Now I wasn't so sure. "Dr. Royce," the director said, his voice deep and measured, his tone carrying the weight of decades in command. "You're suggesting that this object is not only artificial, but capable of directed communication?" "Yes." My voice was steady, though my hands were clammy. "The gravitational waves are modulated in a pattern that defies natural processes. It's intentional." "And you believe it's targeting Earth?" I hesitated, feeling the weight of every skeptical eye in the room. "The data suggests that its orientation is deliberate. I can't say for certain what its intentions are, but—" "Intentions?" one of the senior astrophysicists interrupted. "You're anthropomorphizing a phenomenon we don't even understand. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, Royce. What you're describing could just as easily be an undiscovered natural process." "I've accounted for that," I replied. "I've run every model, every possible scenario. This isn't random noise. It's a signal, and it's aimed at us." The room fell silent. I could feel their skepticism hardening into something colder, dismissal. But then Jacob, who had insisted on accompanying me, cleared his throat. "I've reviewed the data," he said, his tone uncharacteristically grave. "It checks out. Whatever this thing is, it's not an artifact, and it's not a coincidence." The director leaned back in his chair. "We'll review your findings," he said at last. "In the meantime, this remains classified. No public statements, no leaks. Understood?" I nodded, though I could feel a knot of frustration forming in my chest. They didn't believe me. Not fully. But they would. They had to. Back in the control room, I stared at the screen, my thoughts churning. The anomaly's pupil had shifted again, its gaze now almost perfectly aligned with Earth. The gravitational waves had increased in intensity, each pulse like the tick of an invisible clock, counting down to something. It was looking at us, and whatever it was, it wanted to be seen. For days, I worked in the same windowless room, the same muted buzz of computers forming the backdrop to the unease that had burrowed its way into my thoughts. My routine narrowed to staring at screens, running calculations and rechecking trajectories that refused to yield any benign explanation. Jacob, for all his skepticism, had planted himself in the chair beside me, his own exhaustion carving dark grooves under his eyes. Argus's instruments confirmed what I'd feared. The anomaly was emitting gravitational waves in a precise sequence, each burst separated by intervals that varied subtly but carried a discernible mathematical progression. I could feel the weight of the signal, not in any literal sense, but in the sheer audacity of its existence. It was a form of communication, an entity bending the fabric of space-time itself to speak. What it was saying, though, eluded us. "Run it again," I said, pushing the latest sequence to Jacob's console. Jacob shot me a sideways glance, his fingers tapping out a rhythm on his keyboard as he prepared the next analysis. "Royce, we've run it a dozen times. The sequence doesn't change. It's just more of the same, more of whatever this is." "It's not the same. Look at the modulation. The amplitude fluctuates slightly with each burst. That's intentional. It's refining something, trying to adjust." "Adjust what?" "Its aim," Jacob asked, half joking. The humor fell flat. We both knew the question wasn't rhetorical. The gravitational waves weren't the only anomaly. Argus's mid-infrared detectors had picked up thermal emissions from the object, heat signatures that suggested some kind of metabolic process. My thoughts were interrupted by the sharp, static-filled chime of the secure line. I stiffened as the voice of Director Stanton filled the room. "Royce, Jacob, update me." Stanton's voice was clipped, impatient. He wasn't a man accustomed to waiting for answers, and the weight of his authority pressed through every syllable. I exchanged a glance with Jacob before answering. "We've confirmed the anomaly's emissions are accelerating," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "The sequence isn't random, it's mathematical, purposeful, and the object itself is radiating heat. Low levels but consistent. That shouldn't be possible out there in the Oort cloud." There was a pause on the line, the static filling the silence. Then Stanton spoke again, his tone darker. "And its trajectory?" "Steady," I said. "It's continuing to adjust its position relative to Earth. It's aligning." Another pause, longer this time. When Stanton spoke again, his voice carried an edge of something I hadn't heard from him before. Unease. "Keep this contained, Royce. No leaks, no speculation. If the media catches wind of this..." He didn't finish the sentence. The line went dead. I let out a slow breath, staring at the monitor where the anomaly loomed in pixelated brilliance. Jacob said nothing, but I could feel his tension in the way he tapped his pen against the desk. Over the coming days, I spent hours poring over the sequences, searching for meaning in the patterns, but every new piece of data seemed to deepen the mystery rather than clarify it. And then, the signal changed. It happened in the early hours of the morning, when most of the team had either gone home or dozed off at their stations. I was alone in the control room, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring at the latest analysis, when the console emitted a sharp beep. The signal's modulation had shifted, the intervals between bursts collapsing into a near-continuous stream of gravitational oscillations. I blinked at the screen, my heart pounding as the data scrolled past in a dizzying blur. "Jacob!" My voice cracked as I shouted into the empty room. Within moments he appeared, his shirt rumpled and his expression groggy. He took one look at the monitor and froze. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, stepping closer. "It's accelerating, the sequence, it's collapsing, it's..." Before I could finish, the room's primary display lit up with a rendering of the anomaly. The pupil, once a static void, now throbbed with concentric ripples, as if responding to the gravitational waves it emitted. The iris shimmered with a subtle glow, its colors shifting in a mesmerizing kaleidoscopic pattern. It wasn't just communicating, it was reacting. Jacob let out a low whistle. It knows we're watching. My hands moved automatically, capturing the data, running it through every algorithm I could think of, but my thoughts were elsewhere. The anomaly's gaze felt tangible now, like a weight pressing against my chest. It wasn't just looking at us. It was acknowledging us. And then, as abruptly as it began, the signal stopped. The room plunged into silence. On the screen, the anomaly's pupil remained fixed, unblinking, its vast surface eerily still. My stomach churned as I stared at the data feed, which now displayed nothing but a flat line. What does that mean? Jacob asked, his voice small. I don't know, I said, my own voice shaking, but whatever it is, it's not finished. The stillness after the signal's abrupt cessation was worse than the signal itself. For hours I stared at the monitors, waiting for something that would indicate what had just happened. But the anomaly remained unchanged, its massive pupil fixed in an eternal, unnerving gaze. It was as if it had spoken, and now it waited for a response. Jacob paced behind me, the rhythm of his footsteps uneven, as if he couldn't decide whether to leave the room or stay rooted to the unfolding disaster. So what now? He asked. Do we just wait? My hands hovered over the keyboard, fingers twitching with the impulse to do something, to wrest control of the situation from whatever unknowable force was holding us hostage. But what could I do? This wasn't a broken equation or a faulty piece of hardware. It was something so far beyond the scope of human comprehension that even attempting to grasp it felt like an act of hubris. We analyze what we have, I said finally. There's always more in the data. He snorted, not unkindly. Yeah? And what happens when the data tells us we're screwed? The signal may have stopped, but the anomaly itself continued to emit thermal signatures and minuscule gravitational fluctuations, barely perceptible, but steady, like the ticking of a distant clock. I magnified the data streams, isolating patterns, searching for anything that might provide clarity. But every result only deepened the mystery. There was no consistent rhythm, no decipherable logic, just noise, interspersed with flashes of something deliberate that defied categorization. By the time Stanton called for another briefing, I felt like a shell of myself. The walk to the conference room was surreal, as if the weight of the past days had bent the air itself into something thick and cloying. The others shuffled in behind me, Jacob bleary-eyed and unshaven, a pair of junior analysts who looked ready to bolt at the first opportunity, and a cadre of grim-faced military advisors who had appeared seemingly overnight, their presence a reminder that this was no longer purely a scientific endeavor. Stanton sat at the head of the table. His fingers drummed a slow rhythm against the polished surface, the only sound in the room as we settled into our seats. He waited a moment, letting the tension build before speaking. Dr. Royce, he said, his voice even, almost cold. What's your assessment? What was my assessment? That the anomaly was sentient? That it was communicating? That we were nothing more than ants beneath the magnifying glass of some vast and unknowable intelligence? It's waiting for us, I said finally, the words feeling absurd even as they left my mouth. The signal was a message, a question, maybe, and now it's waiting for an answer. Stanton's eyes narrowed slightly. And what do you propose we do about it? I don't know, but ignoring it isn't an option. If it wanted to harm us, it would have done so already. This is something else. It's trying to engage with us. One of the military advisors, a stone-faced man with a buzz cut and a chest full of medals, leaned forward. Engage? With what? We don't even know what it is, let alone what it wants. For all we know, responding could trigger an escalation. I resisted the urge to snap at him, forcing myself to remain calm. Doing nothing could escalate just as easily, I said. This thing is here. It's aware of us. Pretending otherwise doesn't change that. Stanton raised a hand, silencing the room. His eyes bore into me, sharp and calculating. If we were to respond, he said slowly, how would we even begin? The question caught me off guard. It wasn't a rejection. It was a challenge. We use the tools we have. Argus's communications array can replicate the gravitational wave patterns we've observed. It's not perfect, but it's a start. We mimic its signal and send it back, see how it reacts. The room erupted into a storm of objections. Words like reckless and irresponsible were thrown around, but I stayed silent, letting the noise wash over me. Stanton remained motionless, his expression giving nothing away. When the voices finally subsided, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. You're suggesting we communicate with an entity we don't understand, using a method we barely comprehend with no way to predict the outcome, he said. His tone was neutral, but there was a weight behind his words, a warning. Yes, I said simply. For a long moment, Stanton said nothing. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly. Do it. The weight of those two words settled over me like a crushing gravitational pull of their own. Jacob glanced at me, his usual sarcasm absent, replaced by something unspoken, an acknowledgement that we were about to cross a threshold no one had ever dared approach. I keyed in the final commands, aligning Argus's powerful communication array to mimic the anomaly's gravitational wave patterns. It's ready, I said. The control room was silent, every eye fixed on the monitors. Jacob hesitated. We send this, and there's no undoing it. I know. With a final reluctant movement, he pressed the confirmation key. The communications array engaged, and Argus's systems began generating the response signal. It was a crude approximation of the anomaly's bursts, a synthetic attempt at resonance. The gravitational waves rippled outward, a distortion of space-time itself, invisible yet utterly real. I imagined them traveling through the void, crossing incomprehensible distances toward that unblinking eye. Every second dragged like an eternity. The signal would take time to reach the anomaly. Even traveling at the speed of light, it would need hours to cross the gulf of space between Argus and its target. Those hours passed in a haze of monitoring and restless pacing. Finally, the first signs of a reaction came through. The anomaly's pupil shifted. The iris seemed to shimmer, its colors intensifying into sharper, more vivid hues. The veins that laced its surface became darker, thicker, as though some unknown substance coursed through them. It wasn't just moving, it was focusing. The pupil locked onto Earth with an unnerving precision. The iris began to shift subtly, its bands of color rippling in patterns that suggested depth, complexity, and a terrible alien intent. The anomaly's entire surface rippled, its veins pulsing as though responding to an unseen heartbeat. For a moment, the eye seemed to lean closer, an impossible illusion given its scale. But it felt as though it were bearing down on us, the intensity of its focus almost suffocating. And then, in a single, unfathomable instant, it vanished. Gone. No trace, no residual gravitational waves, no thermal emissions, just the echoing silence of the monitors trying to process what they had lost. The room erupted into chaos, voices shouting, keyboards clattering, as analysts scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. It's not possible, Jacob muttered, staring at his screen as though willing it to give him answers. Something that big doesn't just disappear. But it had. In the following weeks, we reviewed every fragment of data from the anomaly's final moments, searching for any clue, any hint of where it had gone or why. Theories ranged from interstellar travel to some form of dimensional shift, but none of them fit. The anomaly had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a silence that felt more ominous than its presence. Months passed. The world moved on, or at least pretended to. Official channels kept the anomaly's existence classified, but rumors spread, as they always did. The scientific community whispered of impossible discoveries, while conspiracy theories flourished in the absence of official answers. For the first time in my career, I found myself wishing for ignorance. Knowing the truth brought no comfort. And then it came back. The alert came in the dead of night, waking me from a restless sleep. My phone buzzed on the bedside table, the emergency tone slicing through the quiet like a scalpel. I fumbled for it, my heart already racing before I saw the words on the screen. Argus alert. Object detected. Lunar vicinity. I was out of the door in minutes, the cold desert air biting at my skin as I rushed to the facility. The control room was in chaos when I arrived, the monitors displaying images that made my stomach lurch. The anomaly was back, but it wasn't in deep space anymore. It was here. It had appeared in orbit, just behind the moon. The images from Argus showed it peeking out from the moon's edge, its massive, unblinking eye partially obscured by the lunar surface. It wasn't simply hovering. It was orbiting the moon in perfect synchronization with its position relative to Earth, always just out of direct sight. The scale was as staggering as ever, but there was something different now. Up close, the details were sharper, more grotesque. The veins crisscrossing its surface were thicker, pulsing faintly, as if with some internal rhythm. The pupil seemed larger, darker, more consuming. It peered around the moon like a voyeur, watching us with an intensity that felt almost predatory. The room was silent as we watched the live feed, the anomaly's presence dominating every screen. I could feel the collective unease radiating from the team, a primal fear that no amount of rationality could suppress. "What the hell is it doing?" Jacob whispered. No one answered. No one could. It stayed there, orbiting silently, its presence oppressive and inexplicable. Days turned into weeks, and the anomaly made no move, no signal, no sign of intent. It simply watched, a cosmic mystery that defied every attempt to understand it. Scientists debated endlessly. Governments scrambled to develop contingency plans, and the public, when the news inevitably broke, descended into panic and speculation. But for all the theories and fears, one truth remained. We didn't know what it was, or what it wanted. And that perhaps was the most terrifying thing of all. The universe has always been a place of unanswerable questions, of vast, indifferent forces operating on scales that dwarf human comprehension. We've spent centuries staring into the void, cataloguing its secrets, dissecting its patterns, daring to believe that we could decode its language. But standing here now, under the silent gaze of this thing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line, that we had been noticed by something we were never meant to meet. Was it curiosity, judgment, a warning, or simply a presence too alien to fit within the confines of our understanding? I didn't know. No one did. But I couldn't stop thinking about how small we were, how fragile, clinging to our thin bubble of atmosphere while forces we couldn't hope to match prowled the edges of existence. The scientists would keep searching for answers, of course. The governments would prepare for every scenario their limited imaginations could conjure. But me, I wasn't sure there was an answer I wanted to hear. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some eyes, once they've turned toward you, never look away. It watched. We waited. And in the silence between us, the universe grew darker.